This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kicking off the show is a cattle market update with Livestock Marketing Information Center agricultural economist Tyler Cozzens. He talks about the recently released trade data. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State soil fertility specialist, continues today's show by reviewing the common nutrient deficiencies soybean growers could be seeing in their crop. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts ends the show with information on packrats. Drew says where they are usually found and how people should be able to manage and control them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update with agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Glad to be here.
Tyler, can you start us off with a cattle market recap?
Just kind of a quick note on the cattle recap side of things. We did have a holiday this last week, so some of the available data and information was a little bit abbreviated for last week. So some of the discussion here is just a little bit on general trends that we have seen over the last week to almost 2 weeks here. And so generally looking at things on the feeder cattle side of things, looking at steers, kind of on the weight breakdowns here of the 5 to 6 weights, generally seeing a little bit stronger trend there, about $3 higher, sitting about $310 to $320 there. 6 to 7 weights sitting a little bit higher there, just over $3 is what we saw over the last week to 2 weeks there. So stronger prices there. But when we get to 700 to 800 pounds and even 800, 900 pounds, prices are a little bit softer there, tracking even to slightly lower than where we saw a year ago, around 260 to 270, depending on those weight groups there. As we get a little bit heavier into the 900 to 1,000 pounds, sitting at about 260, a little bit stronger price than what we've seen over the last few weeks there. Now looking on the heifer side of things, same story there on the weight breakdown side of things, 5 to 600 pounds, seeing those at about 280 to 285 over the last few weeks. That's a little bit softer than what we have seen. But the 6 to 700 weights sitting at about 260. That's about $7 to $8 higher than what we saw over the last couple of weeks. 7 to 800 pounds sitting at about 250 to 255. That's about $10 higher than what we've seen over the last couple of weeks here. And then 8 to 900 pounds are sitting at about 220 to 221. That's about even with where we've been over the last couple of weeks here. On the fed cattle side of things, looking at a live basis here, steers are sitting at about 193 to 194. That's a little bit softer than the week before by about $2. Heifers are sitting about even with where they were, about 193. On a dress basis, sitting at about 313 for both steers and heifers. That's about even with what we've seen over the last week to 2 weeks there. So definitely positive trends there in general for the cattle side of things. Now switching over to the box beef side, looking specifically at choice box beef prices here. That cutout value is definitely seen an uptick here in the last week. I would argue some of that is just sort of this demand from the summer grilling season, kind of around the 4th of July holidays, kind of that peak that we start to see as far as just overall demand for beef in general. So cutout value the last week was sitting at about $3.30 a pound. That's about $6 higher than what we were the week before. So definitely a stronger price there as far as cutout values goes. And we look at some of those primal values, the one that's driving, a couple of them are driving the higher choice box beef prices here over the last week. And that was primarily the round and the brisket, seeing those up about $10 to $11, almost $12 higher for the brisket. Also seeing a stronger trend there for just the rib, chuck, loin, and the short plate, all sitting about $4 to $5 higher than where they were a week ago. And the flank is sitting about even to slightly higher than where it was the week before.
Tyler, today, also wanting to talk about beef trade, some recent reports that have come out, and starting off with what we're seeing for beef exports.
Yeah, so, I think looking at the beef trade side of things, it's always kind of important to keep this in mind because that's another side of the demand equation that we have to factor into just overall the overall demand picture for just beef, not only domestically, but globally as well. And so we recently had the May beef trade data come out from USDA. And so in May, beef exports totaled 260 million pounds. This is about 3% or almost 8 million pounds lower than what we saw last year. So a little bit lower pace there as far as beef exports that we saw in May. But if we look at kind of the top 5 destinations, we can see that Japan exports were down actually 55 million pounds in May. That's actually up 14% or about 7 million pounds from where last year. South Korea beef exports were actually 50 million pounds. That's actually down 23%, or about 14 million pounds from last year. Now, China beef exports were down 9%, or about 4 million pounds from last year to 43 million pounds. Mexico beef exports were actually 27 million pounds. That's an increase of 15%, or 4 million pounds from a year ago. And then rounding out the top five is Canada with beef exports. We're actually down 23%, or 7 million pounds from the previous year to 23 million pounds in May. Now, looking at beef exports through the first 5 months of the year, so total beef exports are actually tracking about 5% below where they were at this time last year. And a lot of that is just lower exports to a lot of the major destinations. So not completely unexpected, just with the lower available supplies that we have to export. But looking specifically at the country exports through the first 5 months of the year, Japan so far this year, Japan has been our top destination for US beef exports so far through this year at 277 million pounds shipped. This is actually down more than 3% from the same period last year. South Korea year to date through May, beef exports are tracking 14% lower to about 264 million pounds shipped. China beef exports are slowing. They're down almost 9% through the first 5 months of the year to about 200 million pounds. That's compared to about 220 million pounds at the same time last year. Mexico is actually one of the bright spots for U.S. beef exports. Mexico has actually seen an increase of about 17% in shipments through the first 5 months of the year to 144 million pounds compared to 123 million pounds at the same time last year. And rounding out the top five, Canada beef exports are down 7% year to date through May to about 100 million pounds. So part of the slowdown in beef exports is tied to a couple factors, such as lower available beef supply that I'd mentioned. This is resulting in higher beef prices. Also, along with that is just a strong dollar affecting exchange rates. So this impacts overall global beef demand.
Tyler, flipping the coin, what about for beef imports?
Yeah, I think a little bit different discussion there. As far as things that are going on the beef import side of things, in May, beef imports were 343 million pounds. That's actually an increase of 10%, or 32 million pounds higher than what we saw last year. Now, looking at specifically at the top five destinations for the month of May for beef imports, Canada was the top supplier of beef in May. Beef imports were actually 76 million pounds in May from Canada. That's up 3% from last year. Australia is the number two supplier in May. Beef imports were 71 million pounds from Australia. That's up 35% from the previous year. New Zealand beef imports were even with a year ago at 56 million pounds. Mexico beef imports were actually down 21% from last year to 49 million pounds. But Brazil May beef imports were 34 million pounds. That's up 15% from last year. Now, in May specifically, beef imports were higher from four of the five top destinations, with Mexico being the exception for the month. Now, if we kind of switch and look at beef imports over the last 5 months since the start of the year, total beef imports were actually tracking about 20% higher than the same period that we were last year. Through May, beef imports are about 1.9 million pounds compared to about 1.6 million pounds during the same period last year. So looking at year-to-date beef imports through May from our top five destinations, Canada beef imports are tracking about 10% higher through 5 months of the year at 436 million pounds. Australia beef imports have increased significantly by 84% to 371 million pounds through May. Now, New Zealand through May, beef imports are up 15% to 260 million pounds. And Mexico year-to-date through May, beef imports are actually tracking 19% lower from Mexico. Now, Brazil beef imports are up 16% from Brazil to 320 million pounds. So I think it's worth noting that of the top five beef imports through the first 5 months of the year, Mexico is the only one posting a year-to-date decline from a year ago. Now, so overall, with the lower available U.S. beef supplies resulting in higher beef prices, this has been a headwind to beef exports. But at the same time, these have also been factors in the rise in beef imports so far this year.
Tyler, our last topic of discussion for today, what are we seeing for cattle imports?
I think it's kind of interesting to discuss sort of the cattle trade side of things, because that's always oftentimes something that we don't always spend as much time on. And so I thought it'd be good to kind of point out a few things there as far as just the cattle import side of things. So specifically looking at just cattle imports, just a couple of highlights. Last year, the U.S. imported nearly 2 million head of cattle. These came almost exclusively from Canada and Mexico. So this was actually an increase of 22%, or 352,000 head over 2022. Now, again, in 2023, cattle imports from Mexico were over 1.2 million head. So the imports from Mexico accounted for about 63% of total cattle imports last year in 2023. Now, imports from Canada in 2023 were 734,000 head. So that makes up the remaining 37% of cattle imports that we saw in 2023. So I think it's an important note as far as the cattle that are imported from both Canada and Mexico, a little bit different things going on there. But the cattle that are imported from Canada are typically our market-ready cattle for slaughter. So those are going to go right into a slaughter facility. While the cattle that are imported from Mexico, those are usually feeder cattle. And oftentimes those are destined straight for a feedlot or backgrounding operation and typically stay kind of in the southern plains regions of the U.S. Now, looking at the actual trade numbers for this year, kind of looking at it on a year-to-date basis through the first 5 months of the year, we're actually sitting at about 1 million head imported so far through the first 5 months. That's actually about 19% or about 150,000 head above where we were at the same time last year. Now, looking at cattle imports from Canada and Mexico from January to May, cattle imports from Canada are up 17% or about 50,000 head to 345,000 head through 5 months of the year. Now, cattle imports from Mexico are up 615, or actually at 615,000 head. This is about 20% higher, or 103,000 head increase from where we were at the same time last year. So although cattle imports are tracking higher through the first 5 months of the year, I do think it's important to note that these are levels that actually we've seen over the last probably about 3 to 5 years ago. These are about typical levels that we saw. So not anything overly aggressive as far as import levels from Canada and Mexico, but definitely noteworthy over the last couple of years, definitely higher, but getting a little bit more to levels that we saw about 3 to 5 years ago.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you.
That was an agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about nutrient deficiency symptoms in soybeans with K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, what are some common symptoms when it comes to nutrient deficiency in soybeans?
Yes, and of course, this is the time of the year when soybean growing, and we may see some different type of issues showing up there. Oftentimes, discoloration, necrosis, and obviously one possibility is nutrient deficiency. And there are many things that we need to keep in mind. And first of all, what are maybe some of the most common ones? We can talk about that, but also how to identify what are the potential nutrient deficiencies. And when we look at some plant nutrient deficiencies, there are essentially two big groups of nutrients in the way they move within the plant, and that has to do also that determine the type of symptoms that we see. We have basically the mobile nutrients and the immobile nutrients within the plant. And first, the group of mobile nutrients within the plants, those are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium. And these are basically nutrients that can move within the plant, which means typically the deficiencies show up in the lower, older leaves, because the plants are basically moving these nutrients towards the new growing parts of the plant. And so those, again, are the mobile within the plant. And then we have the immobile nutrients within the plant, which typically are not able to move within the plant. So therefore, the deficiency symptom tends to show up in the younger, new leaves. So that's one easy way to kind of classify the deficiency symptoms. Of course, the immobile nutrients within the plant are a lot of the micronutrients, things like iron, zinc, sulfur, boron. Those are deficiency symptoms that we may see in some cases in Kansas. And again, usually will tend to show up in the younger leaves. And so again, that's one easy way to start to look at some of those. And of course, each of these nutrients have some specific things that we need to pay attention to as well.
What are some of the reasons producers might be seeing nutrient deficiencies?
Yes, overall, of course, there are many reasons for potential deficiency symptoms. The main one, of course, is that we simply maybe have very low levels of nutrients in the soil. So, of course, we need to follow up with soil tests to confirm that. But in some cases, we do see also some level of nitrogen deficiency, for example, which could be related to poor nodulation. As we know, soybeans going to be fixing most of the nitrogen that's going to use. But again, if we do have poor nodulation, then that can result in nitrogen deficiency. Things like very low pH or very high pH will also affect nutrient availability and nutrient uptake. And so those, again, can be reasons why we're seeing some deficiency symptoms. Again, the best way to find that out is basically with soil tests. And in some cases, we can also see simply some issues with things affecting root development, things like compaction or some root injuries that may be affecting that nutrient uptake. So this is important to think about this because once we identify what is the nutrient deficiency, the next question is what's causing that deficiency. And that's where we oftentimes need to go and collect soil samples to find out exactly what's going on in that soil.
Dorivar today, taking a look at the 7 most common nutrient deficiencies you see in soybeans, and starting off by talking about nitrogen.
Yes, and that may not be something that we think about soybean very, very regularly because, again, soybean is a legume. It fixes nitrogen. And so typically in a good growing conditions, that's not going to be an issue. And we typically will not recommend any nitrogen fertilizer application for soybean. However, we do have situations where nodulation is not very good, and this is simply essentially nodules are not established and essentially are not fixing any of that nitrogen. So we start to see some of that deficiency show up in the plants. And this will typically be just pale green, light color leaves in the soybean as something that will reflect basically that nitrogen deficiency. The reasons for this oftentimes is, again, in cases where we are going to new ground that maybe has no history of soybean in that field. We may not have the rhizobia present in that soil. Sometimes also I mentioned things like pH. We have low pH that may affect the establishment of nodules, and again that result in low nitrogen supply basically to that soybean. So again, it is something we see in many cases, so it's something to pay attention to. Of course, ideally, we want to have good nodulation and we don't have to worry about nitrogen.
Can people pick up that plant and see the lack of nodulation if it's existing?
That's really the best way. It's basically just to examine the roots. Again, we do see some of that pale green. We suspect it's maybe a little bit short of nitrogen. Then digging the roots, looking at those roots and examining the presence of nodule. And that's essentially the best way to identify that issue.
What about if they're lacking iron?
Yes, this is another common nutrient deficiency, especially as we go west where we have high pH soils. Iron chlorosis is very common. And again, as just mentioned, this is a deficiency that usually show in the younger leaves. It is immobile within the plant. And so this is a deficiency symptom that's, like I say, very common in high pH calcareous soils. Oftentimes, there are some possibilities to do some foliar applications to supplement some iron in some cases, but in very severe conditions, it's very difficult to fix this issue in soybean. And so oftentimes we need to be thinking ahead of time when we have high pH, perhaps thinking about in-furrow application of iron, and that's really to get that soybean up to good start. One thing to keep in mind, even though we are not able maybe to recover some of these this year, it's very important to identify those parts of the field that are having iron chlorosis issues for future management. And this is one opportunity that we need to keep in mind, try to identify and map those areas for future management.
Dorivar, what about for phosphorus, that common deficiency?
Yes, this is something that we may also see in soybeans. Have to keep in mind that soybean is a big user of phosphorus. Good yielding soybean can remove easily about 0.8 pounds of P2O5 per bushel of soybeans. So that can add up quickly. In terms of deficiency symptoms, oftentimes what we tend to see more is basically just stunted growth, oftentimes a dark green. We talk a lot about purple color developing in phosphorus, but that may not always show up. But phosphorus in general is a key nutrient for development and growth. So oftentimes that stunted growth is really the most evident symptom that we can see in phosphorus. And so again, one nutrient that we can corroborate with soil tests and hopefully something we can fix in the future if that's the case. But again, it is something that could be quite common because the amount of phosphorus that we use to produce good yielding soybeans.
And also using a lot of potassium?
Yes, that's the other nutrient, and in fact, this is a nutrient deficiency that we tend to see it quite often in eastern Kansas, especially in the southeast part of the state, where we do have quite a bit of soybean. And again, soybean is also a very crop that use a lot of potassium, and so it's one of the crops that use the largest amount of potassium from the crops that we grow. And deficiency symptoms are not uncommon, especially when we start to see low testing potassium levels. This is a deficiency symptom that, again, typically tends to show up in the lower leaves. Potassium is a mobile nutrient within the plant, and so it's very common to see in the lower older leaves. Typically, chlorosis and necrosis around the edge of the leaves is very typical of potassium deficiency. And again, the main reason for this is often low potassium levels in the soil. But one thing that's particular about potassium is that oftentimes it's also related to compaction issues where the roots are basically not growing well. And just because of that limited root growth, we start to see some of that potassium deficiency. So again, this is one situation as well where soil tests is something we need to do, but also just expecting the roots is important. You know, if we do see roots that are basically limited in growth because of compaction, that could explain the reason why we are seeing some potassium deficiency.
What other nutrients do you sometimes see being deficient when it comes to soybeans?
Yes, there are others that we tend to see sometimes. One that is often also show up is manganese, and manganese oftentimes it can be confused with iron as well, or oftentimes they kind of appear in the same situation because manganese is a micronutrient that often happens. Deficiency happens in high pH soil, so we oftentimes tend to have combination of iron chlorosis and manganese deficiency as well happening in those conditions. Not as common for us in Kansas. Another nutrient that we may see in some parts of the U.S. is magnesium as well, but again, those are not very common for us in Kansas. Those are much less common. Typically, I would say potassium, phosphorus, obviously iron chlorosis, and in some cases nitrogen deficiency. Those more likely are the ones that we'll tend to see in our soybean production across the state.
And our last nutrient deficiency for today, Dorivar, sulfur.
Yes, sulfur, it is something that we can see in soybeans. Traditionally, we haven't seen much of this in Kansas, but it's starting to show up in some other produce in other regions in the U.S. Soybean can use quite a bit of sulfur, and depending on the soil conditions, it is something that we can see. It is again immobile nutrient within the plant, so a lot of times we'll see that chlorosis showing up in younger leaves, somewhat similar to what we see in corn and wheat as well.
Dorivar, I appreciate taking the time to join us today and share with us some information around nutrient deficiencies in soybeans.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link resources if you'd like to learn more about this topic. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about packrats with K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
Drew, talking about packrats, however, that's not their official name.
It's not. So we've got two species of rat in Kansas that people would call packrats. One of them is the eastern wood rat, and the other one is the southern plains wood rat. And so if you're north or east of the Arkansas River, it's most likely that you would see the eastern wood rat. And then south and west of the Arkansas River, we would have the southern plains wood rat.
And something you've been receiving quite a few questions about this time of year?
I'm getting a lot more questions about the eastern wood rats, especially from folks in western Kansas, and I think that's probably because we're getting a lot more woody vegetation growing around homes and buildings and even out in pastures and that sort of thing. And so we've got more eastern wood rat habitats, which means that we're going to see more eastern wood rats.
And what are their nests called, and where do people usually find them?
So the wood rats, they like to make nests either under rock crevices, or the more common way that people typically see them are these little brush pile looking sort of dome shaped structures that they build either at the base of a tree or up in a tree sometimes even. but they'll also build them under sheds or in cabinets. And we call those middens, and they're called packrats by most people because they have this habit of going out and collecting things and bringing them back to their midden. And things that they like to collect might be food objects. They also might be shiny things. So they might actually steal things that we want and put them in their nest.
And is stealing things sometimes a problem if people are trying to control them?
Yeah, that habit of taking things back makes the poison baits a challenge to use, because if we don't use something like a paraffin bait block that has a hole through it that we can fasten to an object, then a lot of times they will take those poison baits back to their midden. They won't eat a lethal dose. So it's really most effective if we can fasten those poison baits in a place where they have to eat what they want and can't take them back. The other challenge with that is when they take those poison baits back to their midden, and if they even did die, then we could be exposing pets and even children if that midden was to be taken apart to those poison baits, and we sure don't want to do that.
What are some other control options?
Exclusion is really the best long-term option if they're getting into buildings. And in the buildings, they cause lots of different kinds of damage. But of course, the feces accumulation, their urine smells, and we've got disease potential there. So if they're getting into buildings and we want to exclude them there, we really need to block off any access point that is larger than a ½ inch in diameter. Metal flashing is a good way to do that. They also like to get underneath the hoods of cars. And when they do that, they can do a whole lot of damage, even overnight, but usually it's over maybe a weekend when the car's parked. But they'll get underneath the hood. They like to chew through wires, and they'll make their nest under there and cause lots of damage. Some of the things that people have done that can be effective is to leave the car hood open and have a light shining on the engine overnight. And so by leaving the car hood open, it allows that area to cool overnight. It makes it less safe seeming, and the light also can be a deterrent there as well. Traps are also a really good option that's accessible to many people if we're trying to remove wood rats. And really, the standard rat trap can be very effective, but we have to use it the right way. Wood rats are pretty strong, and so we need to fasten that trap down to something. Works really well to take like a 12-inch section, a 2x4, and either wire the trap to that 2x4 or even run a screw through it and screw it down. Then the next step, after we get it in a place where the wood rats are coming, would be to pre-bait. We can bait this with a piece of fruit or a piece of bacon or peanut butter or something like that. And once the rats are coming and eating that every night, then we want to wire the bait to the trap trigger so that they can't take it away. So then we set the trap and they come along, and that's a good lethal trap. Cage traps can also be effective, and those cage traps need to be about 5 inches by 5 inches and 12 to 15 inches long.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.